Hey guys, tonight we begin with something that might give you chills literally. Imagine waking up on a wooden cot stuffed with straw, your breath forming a little cloud above your face. There's frost on the inside of the wall, your toes are as numb as old carrots, and you swear your bed has turned into a medieval icebox. Welcome to winter in a medieval peasant's cottage. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge out from under your scratchy wool blanket, which smells faintly of sheep and last year's soup. The fire in the hearth has long since burned out, leaving behind cold ashes and the ghost of warmth. Your breath puffs out like a dragon with stage fright. But here's the thing, you're not dead. In fact, you're not even shivering that hard. Because believe it or not, you've been preparing for this all year long. Your first move? Fire. You kneel near the hearth and start coaxing yesterday's embers back to life, using a mix of dried twigs, wall lint, and possibly a prayer or two. Some mornings, you'll toss in dried dung. Yep, cowpats. They were nature's charcoal briquettes, and they burned surprisingly well once the smell stopped bothering you. The fire crackles to life, casting flickering light across the packed earth floor. You hold your hands over it, letting the heat crawl up your fingers and into your bones. Now that you're slightly thawed, it's time to deal with everything else, like your clothes. You slept in most of them already, because why take off what's keeping you alive? But now you add more, a tunic over your undershirt, woolen hose that somehow always itch in the exact same spot, and maybe a cloak if you're going outside. Layering wasn't just fashion, it was strategy. Medieval folks didn't have thermal underwear or Gore-Tex. They had wool, linen, and occasionally fur, stitched together by hand and worn like a portable cocoon. You might look like a walking hay bale, but you'd be a warm hay bale. Historians still argue whether some outer layers were just reused sacks, but hey, sacks have their charm. And while we're on the topic of warmth, let's talk about those drafty walls. Your house isn't insulated. The walls are wattle and daub, essentially sticks covered in mud, and your roof is thatch. It leaks sometimes. It moans in the wind. But it does trap some heat. If you're lucky. Still, you've stuffed gaps with straw, rags, and even moss. Not glamorous, but it's surprisingly effective until a mouse family decides to move in. In wealthier households, and by wealthier I mean owns more than one chicken, windows might be covered in thin parchment or horn to let in light without letting in the cold. In your case, though, a wooden shutter will do. It blocks drafts and daylight equally. Let's be honest, you're not seeing the sun till March anyway. Now, once that hearth is glowing and your layers are on, you start the morning routine. Maybe fetch water from a frozen stream. Maybe check on the animals who are often sleeping inside with you. Goats, pigs, even cows sometimes shared space with people in winter. Their body heat helped warm the room, and your breath? Well, let's just say it wasn't the worst smell in the house. Breakfast is simple. Porridge, if you're lucky. Stiff bread dunked in broth if you're not. But it's warm, and it keeps you going. You eat close to the fire, with your family gathered around like a bunch of sleepy squirrels. And let's be real, you're not spending hours outdoors unless you have to. Winter work is minimal. You mend tools, patch clothing, tell stories, pray the roof doesn't collapse under the snow. You're conserving energy, hibernating in human form. Here's a fun, if slightly weird, tidbit. Some folks used hot rocks for warmth. Heated in the fire and wrapped in cloth, they were tucked into beds, shoes, or even used as medieval heating pads. Historians still argue whether some peasants used warmed bricks or leftover stew pots as DIY foot warmers. Either way, you'd take what you could get. And through all of this, every cold morning, every itchy layer, every shared breath with your goat, you don't freeze to death. Not because it wasn't cold. It absolutely was. But because you adapted. You prepared. You found warmth in wool, in fire, in huddles, and in routines passed down like heirlooms. So next time you complain about having to get out of bed when your thermostat dips below 70, just remember, a medieval peasant survived with nothing but moss, wool, and optimism. Oh, and a really smoky fire. You're still tucked inside that crooked cottage, and outside, winter growls like a wolf just beyond the shutter. But you're safe mostly because today, you're dressing the medieval way, layer upon glorious, itchy, questionably clean layer. You pull on your second tunic of the day. It's coarse wool, dyed a muted brown that might once have been green before several seasons of wear and medieval laundry downgraded its status. Underneath, you've got a linen shirt, threadbare but still hanging in there, and over all of it goes a thick cloak clasped at the shoulder with a bit of bent metal that used to be a spoon. Fashion week it isn't, but functional? Absolutely. Because here's the first real trick of not freezing to death when central heating doesn't exist. You layer like your life depends on it, because it does. The more layers you wear, the more little pockets of air get trapped between them, and air is a surprisingly good insulator. You've basically turned yourself into a walking lasagna of survival. Medieval peasants didn't have closets packed with outfits. They had a handful of garments, worn in rotation until they were more stitch than fabric. But they knew how to stack them. A shirt, a tunic, maybe a second tunic if you're fancy. Wool hose, the medieval answer to long johns, are wrapped around your legs and tied up with bits of string. If your feet are really lucky, you've stuffed them with straw before jamming them into leather shoes that scream, "I was a cow once and I still hold a grudge." Historians still argue whether all peasants owned winter cloaks or if many simply braved the cold in layered tunics, but what's clear is that wool was king. Sheep were everywhere, and their fluffy coats turned into everything from bedding to hats. Wool was warm even when damp, which, let's be honest, it often was because your house leaks, the snow sneaks in, and you're always about 30 seconds from being cold and wet. Now let's address the elephant in the room, or more accurately, the stench. These layers didn't get washed often. Maybe once a month. Maybe. Your underlayers might get rinsed in a stream and beaten against a rock, but wool outerwear? It was more likely to be scraped, brushed, and then hung near the fire to air out, which is medieval code for get smoky enough to mask everything else. You smelled like a combination of campfire, turnip, and wet dog. But hey, so did everyone else. There's something almost genius about how peasants dressed for bed, too. You didn't undress to sleep, you just wrapped yourself tighter. Some folks even wore their cloaks to bed, or shared one among several people. You curled up on straw mattresses with wool blankets, fur pelts if you were lucky, and every stitch of clothing you had. The goal wasn't comfort, it was to avoid becoming a medieval popsicle. And while we're on fur, yes, it was a thing. Fox, rabbit, even squirrel if the opportunity presented itself. If it had fur and it wandered too close to the village, it probably ended up as someone's shoulder wrap. These furs were sewn into collars, lined cloaks, or even turned into hats that doubled as winter helmets. One quirky tidbit: it wasn't uncommon to wear the fur with the skin side out in some regions, since the hair could trap snow and get wet. Historians still debate whether that was a style choice or just a misunderstanding of thermodynamics. You might also see someone in a hood, or a coiffé snug cloth cap worn under everything else to trap head heat. Because let's not forget, 40% of your body heat escapes from your head. Okay, modern science has debunked that specific number, but in a drafty cottage with a roof that groans in the wind, any uncovered skin feels like a portal to the ice dimension. Even hands got creative solutions. Mittens were rare among the poorest, but wrapping your hands in scraps of wool or using the ends of your sleeves like pockets. Totally normal. Your sleeves could hang down past your fingers, forming natural hand warmers that made eating soup a bit of a challenge, but gave you a fighting chance against frostbite. Now picture this: it's midnight. The fire's burned low. Your nose is so cold it feels detachable. But your body? It's layered, tucked, and burrowed deep beneath layers of wool and fur and perhaps one disgruntled family cat. You're not toasty by any stretch of imagination, but you're not freezing either. And that's the goal. If you wake to use the chamber pot, and yes, let's not forget that delightful bucket of joy you do so fully dressed. Because taking anything off in the middle of the night is a dangerous game. So you shuffle across the room like a quilted ghost, do your business, and dive back into your nest before the cold seeps into your bones. And somehow, year after year, peasants made it through. Not because they had high-tech gear or cozy flannel pajamas, but because they led smart, moved strategically, and embraced the slightly funky practicality of wool. So next time you're bundled up in your fleece hoodie, sipping cocoa in a heated house, take a moment to honor the medieval peasant layered like an onion, a little itchy, a lot smelly, and stubbornly warm. Your nose is still a little pink from last night's frost, but it's morning again, and as you stretch under your straw-stuffed bedding, something shifts fur. A lot of it. Not yours, mind you. Tucked beside you is a pelt, maybe two, draped over your shoulders like some medieval burrito wrap. And if you're lucky, that furry bundle might still have the faint scent of fox or weasel, depending on what was unlucky enough to get caught last autumn. Fur wasn't a luxury for peasants, it was insulation with a face. If it had warm blood and made the mistake of wandering too close, it might become next season's foot warmer. Foxes, rabbits, badgers, whatever could be trapped, skinned, and sewn got used. Not that your cottage looked like a royal fur parlor. It was more like a taxidermy student's fever dream, with patches of pelts stitched together, rough side out or in, depending on which bit was softer. Historians still argue whether peasants lined their cloaks with fur or just made separate wraps and hoods, but either way, those scraps were prized and often passed down like family heirlooms. And then there was straw. Not the most glamorous bedding, but hear me out, it was cheap, abundant, and surprisingly effective. Your mattress might be a sack or just a corner of the room piled with straw and flattened over time by your body weight and gravity's gentle cruelty. You'd fluff it occasionally, though fluff might be generous, for kick it around and pretend it's not moldy. Of course, straw had its quirks. It crackled every time you moved, And let's just say you weren't the only one who liked sleeping in it. Fleas, lice, and the occasional mouse made regular appearances. But hey, those mice gave off a bit of warmth too, right? Right? Let's zoom in on your bedding setup. Beneath you, straw. Around you, wool blankets, fur pelts, maybe even a coarse linen sheet if you were feeling fancy. Above you, nothing but thatched roof, leaking in drafts and the occasional spider. But here's where the peasant genius kicked in. You didn't sleep alone. Not emotionally. Not spatially. You shared that bedding with siblings, children, maybe grandparents, and on particularly icy nights, an animal or two. A piglet under the blanket was worth a dozen hot water bottles. Chickens roosted on ledges above. A dog might curl at your feet, a living toe warmer with halitosis. This was body heat at its finest. You might not love your neighbor during the day, but at night, they were a warm back and a snoring wall against the chill. Fringe tidbit. There's some debate over whether families slept in a heat sandwich formation, older folks in the middle, kids on the outside. Others argue everyone just piled in like medieval lasagna and hoped for the best. And it wasn't just about sleeping. Staying warm was an all-day, multi-sensory strategy. You drank warmth too. That meant warm ale, thin gruels, or broths made from whatever bones, onions, or herbs you had lying around. Some households even served mulled wine, heated with spice if you could afford it, or just reheated until it scared away bacteria. That funk you're smelling? Not the stew, it's you. Hygiene was limited, especially in winter. You bathed rarely, if at all, and laundry was not a daily or weekly thing. Washing wool clothing too often ruined it, and water was icy. You might air out your linens or give them a stern brushing, but full-body scrub downs, reserved for summer or desperate times. Historians still argue if peasants used hot stones in basins to warm washing water, but most agree they stank with purpose. But don't mistake funk for filth. It was strategic. Dirty clothes were often warmer than clean ones, especially if they had absorbed a bit of smoke and sweat, a layer of human patina that helped trap heat. Plus, washing in freezing weather meant risking hypothermia. So yes, you smelled like a goat, but a warm goat. Your home smelled accordingly. A blend of damp wool, cooked roots, peat smoke, old wood, and a whisper of mildew. If someone tried to bottle it today, it'd be called Ye Olde Hearth No. 5. But within those funky walls, life kept humming. Your cottage might be small, with low ceilings and one smoky window, but it held in the smells, the warmth, and the vital body heat that made winter survivable. So, you bundle in those layers, hug a fur wrap to your chest, sip something warm, and settle near the hearth. The world outside might be frozen and silent, but inside, there's heat scavenged, shared, and stubbornly clung to. And you? You're not freezing. You're surviving with fur, with funk, and with a lot of surprisingly effective straw. You're hunched by the hearth now, the fire finally licking back to life like a sleepy dragon poked with a stick. It's not a grand fireplace like you'd find in a noble's manor, no sculpted mantelpiece, no roaring blaze, but it's the soul of your home. A squat, soot-stained pit, maybe with a rough chimney or just a hole in the roof above to coax the smoke out. Mostly, the hearth wasn't just the heat source. It was your stove, your lantern, your security system, your medieval flat-screen entertainment center. If it happened indoors in winter, it happened here. Cooking, storytelling, wall spinning, cat warming, it all unfolded in this smoky little semicircle of warmth. You shuffle closer to it now, feeling the radiant heat soak into your knees through scratchy hose. Your wooden stool's got a burn mark from sitting too close last week, but you pretend it adds character. This isn't just a place to thaw your fingers. This is your survival zone. You feed the fire carefully. Wood is precious. If you're lucky, you've stocked a winter's supply carefully chopped and stacked since late summer. If not, you might be burning peat, dried dung, or hedge trimmings, whatever crackles and doesn't explode. Some peasants even mixed clay with dung to make slow-burning fuel bricks. They smelled like choices, but they worked. The hearth wasn't just the warmest part of the house. It was a symbol. A living heart, always needing to be fed, watched, and kept alive. Letting it go out wasn't just inconvenient, it could be dangerous. Restarting a fire from scratch with flint and tinder wasn't easy, especially with frozen fingers and damp kindling. That's why embers were carefully banked at night, buried under ash to keep them smoldering until morning. Fun fact? In some villages, if your fire died completely, you'd borrow embers from a neighbor. Historians still argue whether this was a communal gesture or a passive-aggressive competition to see who had the better kindling technique. Either way, showing up with a bucket and a sheepish grin usually worked. While the hearth warmed your body, it also warmed your food, and that meant life. The usual fare? Stews, gruels, or thick porridge-like concoctions stirred with a stick that doubled as a back scratcher when no one was looking. You didn't need a timer. You cooked until it stopped being crunchy. Smells filled the house: boiled onions, root vegetables, maybe a hint of smoked bacon if it had been a particularly good harvest. But let's be honest, the dominating scent was smoke. Thick, meaty, inescapable smoke that clung to your clothes, your hair, your soul. You didn't just live with it, you marinated in it. The walls around the hearth were often black with soot. Some peasants hung herbs or sausages up high to dry, using the smoke like a culinary bodyguard. Others draped damp clothes nearby, creating a cozy, if steamy, cloud of damp wool and boiled turnip. At night, this corner became a communal nest. The oldest sat nearest the flames because they needed it most, and children curled around them like cats. If you listened closely, you'd hear the creak of old bones, the occasional slurp of stew, and a running commentary from that one uncle who always thought he could fix the chimney with a stick and a prayer. And it wasn't all domestic calm. The fire also cast shadows, and shadows meant stories. Tales of frost giants, frozen maidens, talking animals, and vengeful saints who punished people for stealing bread. In the dark months, imagination flourished. The line between warmth and wonder blurred. You listened with wide eyes, mouth full of barley mash, while embers glowed like ancient stars in the ashes. Sometimes, small tasks spun out by the fire: mending clothes, whittling a spoon, carding wool. Hands kept busy, minds stayed sharp, and the heat worked its magic on stiff joints. The hearth was therapy before therapy. Now, quirky historical aside, some medieval folks believed hearth spirits lived in the fire. Not just metaphors, actual spirits. You treated them with respect, never cursed at the flames, never spit into the ashes. Some left offerings: a crust of bread, a splash of ale, because if you ticked off the hearth spirit, you might just wake up to cold ashes and bad luck. And when it came to sleep, the hearth glowed on like a nightlight. No real privacy here, just the occasional curtain hung across the room or around a bed if you had one. But the fire offered comfort. A flicker, a crackle, a steady orange heartbeat that said, "You're still alive, still warm, still here." So you curl your feet toward the fire, wrap your cloak tighter, and stare into the dancing flames. The world outside may be a frozen wasteland, but in this little corner, glowing with warmth, smoky stories, and the scent of something edible if unidentifiable bubbling in a pot, you've carved out a tiny miracle. Because in a medieval winter, surviving the night wasn't just about enduring the cold. It was about making the most of every ember. The frost outside thickens like a second wall, coating the bare branches in silver and freezing puddles into glass. But inside your cottage, something curious is happening. You step over the threshold from the sleeping corner toward the hearth, careful not to trip on a goat. Yes, a goat. Maybe two. In medieval winters, the line between barn and living room got a little fuzzy. Your home might be a simple one-room hut, or perhaps it had a partial loft or a sectioned-off area for sleeping. But when temperatures dropped and staying alive became a group project, everyone and everything pitched in, including the livestock. You didn't bring your animals in because you loved the smell of wet sheep. You did it because body heat was a precious commodity. Each creature, from chickens to cows, gave off warmth like a little organic furnace. A cow alone could heat up the room just enough to prevent your breath from turning into icicles. Plus, they were less likely to die of exposure if they were snoozing by your firewood pile. It wasn't uncommon for smaller animals to sleep inside full-time during winter. Chickens roosted on beams or ledges overhead. Pigs snorted under benches. The dog slept on your feet, and the cat patrolled for mice that liked to burrow into your straw mattress. One fringe report from a German chronicle even mentions ducks waddling indoors during a particularly harsh freeze. It's unclear if they were welcomed guests or loud, flat-footed accidents waiting to happen. The smell? You got used to it. Kind of. The heat they provided was worth the ambient barnyard bouquet. And honestly, everything else in the cottage probably reeked too: smoke, wet wool, stew in progress, Uncle Ulrich's foot fungus. It all blended into a kind of old hearth number 5 fragrance that let you know you were home. Now, let's talk about layout. In a lot of peasant homes, the structure was divided roughly in half, one side for the people, the other for the animals. A central hearth might serve both zones. Your cow had its corner, your goats theirs, and you had a slightly elevated sleeping platform, if only to avoid stepping on someone mid-snore or mid-moo. And yes, your kids probably named the chickens. Try telling them not to snuggle Speckles on a frosty night. You might assume animals inside meant dirtier living, and you'd be right but also wrong. The animals' presence actually helped reduce disease in one weird way. By keeping the house warm, they reduced the risk of respiratory infections from constant cold. Plus, they discouraged rodent infestations unless, of course, you kept grain under your bed, which was also a thing. Sometimes the lines between pantry, barn, and bedroom blurred more than your vision in the smoke. Of course, not all animals were allowed free rein. Horses, for instance, usually stayed in separate outbuildings or lean-tos. They were bigger, messier, and had a tendency to kick things you couldn't afford to replace. But smaller stock? The more the merrier, at least until someone pooped in your boots. Historians still argue whether this indoor livestock setup was common across all regions or more of a northern European phenomenon. In Scandinavian areas, it was practically a winter doctrine. In milder climates, people might still let the chickens sleep outside as long as they weren't laying ice cubes in the morning. And when spring finally arrived, out they went. Not with fanfare, but with a lot of shoving and a broom. The cottage got swept out, straw replaced, and everyone pretended like the pigs hadn't spent 4 months sleeping beside the baby's cradle. But in the heart of winter, it made perfect sense. The more warm bodies, the better. And if that meant waking up nose to nose with a goat named Buttercup, so be it. She was family now. You'd even talk to them. Not out loud, necessarily, though you might, if the stew wasn't ready yet and you needed to vent. But in those long, dark winter nights, the line between companion and heater got blurry. And when the wind howled and snow piled high against the door, a snoring piglet could be just the reassurance you needed. Because in a world without radiators, heating oil, or even decent windows, you took your warmth wherever you could find it, even if it had hooves. You press your palm against the wall, mud cold, slightly damp, and reassuringly solid. It's not a modern wall, with studs and drywall and insulation. It's a medieval masterpiece, a glorious blend of sticks, mud, straw, and optimism known as wattle and daub. And in winter, this messy sandwich of nature and elbow grease is the only thing between you and the screaming wind outside. Let's unpack the magic. Wattle refers to the woven wooden slats, thin branches, reeds, or whatever was handy crisscrossed like a giant basket. Daub is what you smeared over it, a mix of clay, soil, animal dung, and straw. Sound gross? It was. But it worked. The combination dried into a hard surface that could hold heat surprisingly well, especially once you got a few good layers built up. And when the weather turned nasty, that wall of muck and twigs could hold off the chill just long enough to keep your breath from frosting indoors. Think of it like nature's insulation, smelly, crumbly, but serviceable. The roof above your head? Thatched. Straw layered thickly, sometimes a foot or more, to trap heat and keep out rain. Or try to. Because let's be honest, thatch leaks. Snow gets in. Mice move in. Birds nest. But if it's done well, that thatch also breathes, meaning it doesn't trap moisture like a wool sock in July. The trick was keeping it dry and patching it faster than it fell apart, which was always. Interestingly, some peasants went a step further and used turf, actual sod with the grass side out, for insulation. It added heft, greenery, and a nice place for goats to stand and judge you from the roof. Historians still debate how common sod roof homes were in medieval Europe versus other regions, but the idea stuck. Sometimes literally. And the floor? Not wood. Not tile. Just packed earth. You swept it with a branch. You patted it down when it cracked. Some households even sprinkled sweet-smelling herbs or rushes over it to absorb moisture and, fingers crossed, mask odors. Spoiler alert, it mostly just made the place smell like minty goats. To block out drafts, you stuffed gaps with whatever you could find: moss, old cloth, tufts of wool, or even dried manure if things got desperate. Door frames were lined with rags, window slats patched with oiled parchment or thin leather. You became a master at locating and plugging the tiniest sliver of breeze. No glass, by the way. That was for churches and nobles. Your windows were holes with shutters or bits of translucent horn scraped thin. They let in light, sure, but also a fair bit of cold. So you kept them shut unless absolutely necessary. Bright days in winter were rare anyway, and too much light meant heat loss. Let's talk ceiling height. Low. Oppressively low. Tall people learn to duck. Why? Because heat rises, and keeping that warm air in arm's reach was essential. Some cottages had beams you could hang things from, drying herbs, sausages, or the day's wet cloak. And in winter, it wasn't uncommon to feel like you lived in a combination wardrobe and chimney. You smelled like one too. Over time, the smoke from your hearth darkened the rafters, cured the thatch, and occasionally encouraged black mold to set up shop. But the flip side? That smoke also acted like medieval bug spray. Insects hated it. So did your lungs, but hey, can't win them all. And then there were the walls within the walls. You didn't have rooms, per se, but you created little zones. Curtains of heavy cloth, maybe old cloaks hung from rope, sectioned off sleeping areas. Not for privacy, but to trap body heat. Your bed became its own microclimate, cold outside the blanket, sauna inside. Sometimes you even insulated the walls themselves. Yes, a few creative folks tried tacking old cloth or spare wool onto walls, essentially quilting the interior. Did it look good? No. Did it help? A little. Every scrap helped you stay 1 degree closer to not freezing. There's an ongoing debate among historians about whether peasants' homes were truly warm or just less freezing. The consensus? Somewhere in between. You weren't living in luxury, but thanks to those mud walls, straw roofs, and a whole lot of elbow grease, you weren't dying either. Even the design of your home helped. A small, squat space meant less air to heat. No open concept here. Cozy, cramped quarters meant every breath, every ember, every simmering stew contributed to the temperature. You became the insulation. You were the HVAC system. And when things got really desperate, some folks built what were basically blanket forts around the bed. Drape a thick curtain from the ceiling, tuck it under the mattress, and boom, your own private medieval sauna. Smelled like boiled socks and wet cabbage, but it was warm. So tonight, as the wind howls and the shutters creak, you run your fingers along the bumpy, slightly squishy wall. You feel the chill on the other side. But inside, you've built something stubborn and sturdy. Not beautiful. Not perfect. But strong enough to hold back the cold. Because in the medieval world, staying alive wasn't about style, it was about stuffing straw in the cracks and praying your roof held through the storm. The wind moans outside like a forgotten ghost, curling around your thatched roof and poking icy fingers through every possible gap. But you've got a secret weapon: cloth. Not magic cloth, not velvet tapestries fit for a king, but heavy, patched up curtains and blankets hanging in the most peculiar places. You pass through one now, pushing aside a thick wool drape that serves as your cottage's makeshift door. It used to be a cloak. Maybe still is, on emergencies. But tonight, it's guarding your home's only entrance like a shaggy sentry, blocking the drafts that always sneak through the uneven frame. Because the wooden door, such as it is, doesn't seal tightly. There's always a sliver of air slipping in, so this curtain's doing double duty, draft blocker and portable wall. That's the thing about medieval peasant homes, they were full of clever, low-tech hacks for dealing with the cold. And curtain placement was one of the most vital. You didn't just hang cloth over doors. You hung it across sleeping areas, windows, sometimes even across beams to create pockets of warmer air. You move past another curtain, this one over a window slit barely wider than your hand. On bright days, the cloth might be drawn back to let in pale, watery sunlight. But now, it's pulled tight, forming a rough wool seal. No glass. No pane. Just a shutter and some old fabric flapping gently like a tired flag of domestic survival. Then there's the bed. Or rather, the nook where sleeping happens, a wooden platform stuffed with straw, wedged into a corner with its own private curtain. Not for privacy, let's be honest. Personal space is a fever dream in this house, but to trap heat. You slip behind the curtain and feel the air warm by a few blessed degrees. It's stale, sure, but cozy stale. Body heat from last night still clings to the fabric like a shy ghost that doesn't want to leave. And now, let's get weird. Did you know some medieval folks hung curtains from the ceiling? Not as decoration, but as strategic heat traps. You might string a cloth from one beam to another to divide the room, especially around the hearth, so the warmth didn't just zoom straight up into the rafters. Imagine living inside your own personal tent, inside your own house. That's medieval efficiency right there. Historians still debate how widespread this practice was, especially among the poorer classes. But there are records of it in monastic dormitories and better-off peasant homes, particularly in colder regions. Even in one-room cottages, the concept of curtained warmth wasn't foreign. Some people even wore their curtains, sort of like oversized shawls or wraparound cloaks that doubled as bedding and mobile insulation. And yes, you'd reuse everything. That patchwork curtain over your bed? It might be stitched from an old cloak, a grain sack, and a bit of cloth salvaged from your uncle's mysteriously vanished tunic. Nothing went to waste, not in winter, and not when warmth was currency. There's a bit of a fringe legend about some peasants using curtains soaked in vinegar or herbs as air purifiers. The idea was that the cloth would clean the smoke or bad smells wafting through the cottage. Did it work? Probably not. Did it make the place smell slightly less like feet and turnips? Arguably. Historians are still side-eyeing that one. Let's not forget how curtains played into lighting. You might hang a dark cloth near the hearth to reduce glare or redirect flickering firelight into sleeping zones. Or you might hang a lighter fabric near the ceiling to bounce candlelight downward, though let's be real, you didn't burn many candles. Too expensive. Firelight or starlight had to do. And sometimes, the curtains just made you feel better. In a world without insulation, electricity, or even a halfway decent seal around the door, a thick curtain wasn't just a barrier. It was a boundary. A sign that this little corner was yours, and it was safe, and it was warmer than whatever frozen madness lurked outside. Even a psychological boost mattered. When you crawled into your curtained bed nook and pulled the wool around your shoulders, it wasn't just about physical heat. It was about tucking yourself into something familiar, something human. In the dark, howling quiet of a medieval winter, that kind of comfort was priceless. So tonight, as the storm outside rattles the shutters and the rafters creak like sleepy bones, you tighten your little curtain, wrap yourself into a blanket that used to be a coat, and curl up behind the fabric barrier that might not stop a bear but can stop a draft. And that's good enough. Because in a world where surviving winter was a daily improvisation, you didn't just fight the cold, you outwitted it. With cloth, cleverness, and the kind of determination only found in someone who just wants one warm night without their toes going numb. Your hands are cold. Not frostbite cold, but that achy, dull sort of cold that wraps around your bones like clingy fog. You settle onto the bench by the hearth, shift your wool layers, and reach for your cup. It's steaming gently, and as you bring it to your lips, the warmth spreads through your face like a sunrise. It's not tea. It's not hot cocoa. It's warm ale. Maybe with a lump of onion floating in it, if someone got fancy. Drinking warmth was just as vital as wearing it. You couldn't always get near the hearth, and you couldn't carry the fire with you. But you could cradle a warm cup, sip it slow, and let that heat work its magic from the inside out. In medieval winter, that was survival disguised as beverage. Hot drinks weren't about flavor. They were about fuel. What you drank varied depending on what you had, what you could grow, and what you didn't mind boiling into oblivion. Onion broth was a favorite, cheap, simple, surprisingly nutritious. Add water, salt, if you had it, and maybe a bit of lard or stale bread. Simmer it down to something that resembled soup and hope no one asks for a second helping. There's a steaming bowl in your lap now. It smells like garlic, earth, and wet wood. You slurp it noisily because manners are for the warm and instantly feel your insides thaw. Broth like this didn't just warm you. It filled you. Gave your body the calories it needed to keep burning heat long after the fire dimmed. You might also drink hot beer. Not the frothy kind you get at a pub, but a yeasty, flat, soupy concoction home-brewed, sometimes a little sour, always warm. Fermented beverages were safer than water in many cases, and the slight alcohol content added a bit of faux courage for braving the icy dawn. And when you could swing it, spiced wine. Usually reserved for holidays or important feast days, mulled wine was a treat heated over the hearth with whatever spices you could steal, forage, or barter for. Cinnamon, cloves, and even ginger if you were especially lucky. The kind of thing that filled the house with the smell of almost riches. One sniff and you felt like maybe, just maybe, you could survive till spring. But the everyday go-to? Gruel. A hot slurry of oats or barley or ground peas, cooked down with water and maybe some milk if the cow hadn't frozen over. Gruel was the medieval smoothie. Thick, warm, utterly bland, but capable of getting you through a day in the fields or a night by a smoky fire. Historians still argue over whether peasants added herbs for flavor or just for health. Some swore by adding thyme or sage to keep the humors balanced. Others stirred in nettles or dandelion roots. Either way, if it grew in your yard and didn't kill you, it probably ended up in your pot. And here's a quirky tidbit: some winter drinks weren't drinks at all. They were hot slops, designed to be eaten with a spoon but thin enough to sip. Like cabbage soup without the cabbage, or meat stew without the meat. These hybrid meals were served in big communal bowls, everyone dipping bread or slurping from their own carved wooden cup. The act of drinking together around the hearth was half the point. You weren't just warming your hands. You were warming your soul. Sharing warmth, calories, and stories in equal measure. The clink of mugs, the hiss of the pot, the occasional slurp, it was your winter soundtrack. You didn't need variety. You needed volume. Calories kept you warm. That's why meals were heavy, even when ingredients were light. a belly full of hot starch meant a night with fewer shivers. Sure, you might dream of roast meat or honeyed cakes, but when the snow fell sideways and the wind yanked at the shutters, even lukewarm onion broth was a blessing. And speaking of warmth, some folks believed certain drinks could actually chase out the cold spirits. Mead, in particular, was sometimes warmed and consumed in religious or community rituals. Raise your cup, toast the season, and hope that the warmth lasted long enough to carry you into the next one. So you drink. Slowly. Refill your cup. Hug it like a friend. Let the heat seep into your fingers and spread through your ribs. You sip it again and stare into the fire, eyes heavy, cheeks pink. Because in this world, when warmth is precious, drinking it becomes an art. And in that moment, steam curling up from your cup, flames flickering, shadows on the wall, you feel the tiniest flicker of something close to luxury. Your stomach is full, well, fuller than usual, and the steam from your wooden cup has finally stopped. The fire pops softly, casting flickering light across the low-beamed ceiling. You shuffle back toward the sleep corner, and now it's time for the oldest form of winter survival, the cuddle pile. No, it's not glamorous. It's not even particularly comfortable. But it works. Everyone huddled together like medieval penguins, parents, kids, grandparents, and maybe the dog if he hadn't claimed the hearth already. You lie down, not in a soft bed, but on a straw-stuffed mattress that crunches under your weight, and feel bodies press in around you. No one complains. This is warmth. In the absence of insulation, your best heater was each other. Body heat didn't just make you feel better. It literally kept you alive. Scientists today call it thermal radiation. You called it, don't roll away or we all freeze. Babies slept tucked in crooks of arms or pressed against older siblings. Children nestled beside parents, and the elderly, more vulnerable to cold, got the warmest spots, in the center of the tangle. If someone got up to use the chamber pot, they had to fight their way out like a mole tunneling through a wall-covered anthill. Sometimes you'd even sleep sitting up. Sounds weird, but there's logic to it. In very cold conditions, lying flat could feel colder as your body pressed against the frigid ground. Sitting propped with others around you meant less surface area touching the cold floor, and more warmth concentrated around vital areas. It wasn't restful, but it was practical. Historians still debate whether this posture was common or only in truly harsh winters, but folklore makes frequent mention of the huddled watch, where families sat back to back through the longest nights. And no, you didn't sleep through the night straight through. That's a modern expectation. Back then, you experienced segmented sleep. First sleep, then a wakeful period, then second sleep. During that in-between time, you might stir the fire, whisper prayers, or tell stories. Sometimes you just lay there, watching the dim coals glow like sleepy eyes. You weren't anxious about being awake. It was expected. Let's not forget the animals. Yes, they were back. The chickens up on the shelf above your feet, muttering softly in their dreams. The piglet, warm and slightly fart-scented, curled beside the youngest. The family dog, definitely on your legs, radiating heat and smugness. There's a comfort in the noise. Gentle snoring. The shuffle of woolen feet. The occasional fart that makes everyone groan in unison. You know what? This is community. This is survival. And it doesn't smell too bad if you don't inhale too deeply. quirky tidbit: some people believed sleeping close together helped dreams pass between folks. That warmth wasn't just physical, it was spiritual. And maybe in the dead of winter, huddled under a shared cloak, that idea didn't seem so far-fetched. Some nights, when the wind howled louder than usual, you'd all tighten the bundle. Someone might throw another blanket over everyone like a tarp, and the weight added comfort. No one moved much. You found your warmth bubble and stayed there. Wiggle the wrong way and someone's cold foot found your spine. And if someone fell ill, flu, cough, winter shivers, you made space anyway. A corner of the cuddle pile for the sick, with hot cloths and constant prayers. Because even illness couldn't be allowed to chill too far. The communal warmth wasn't just a peasant thing, by the way. Monks did it too. Pilgrims, travelers, soldiers, anyone trying to survive a stone-cold building in January knew the power of huddling. It was humbling. Egalitarian. No one cared who snored if they kept your toes warm. So tonight, as you shift and adjust your lumpy straw pillow, you listen to the rhythm of your little family, breath, creaks, the occasional sneeze. A harmony of survival. Outside, snow blankets the world in silence. Inside, under your patched-up curtain, the warmth is real, and it is shared. You sigh. The air is thick, the room is close, and the blankets are scratchy. But you're not alone. You're warm. You're breathing. You're still here. And sometimes, in a medieval winter, that's all that mattered. The morning frost still clings to the window shutter like it's afraid of the sun. You peek out through a cracked grey sky, frozen ground, not a single bird daring to chirp. Which is good, because you're not exactly sprinting out the door either. Winter in the medieval world didn't come with snow days or central heating. But it did come with an unofficial slowing down of life. The rhythm of the year shifted, not because anyone said so, but because the cold said no. You weren't plowing fields in January. You weren't washing clothes daily. You were surviving. You roll out from the human nest of last night, your joints creaking louder than the floorboards. You layer up again, shuffle to the hearth, and nudge the coals back to life. Another day begins, but with a gentler cadence. Winter work wasn't glamorous. It wasn't heroic. But it was essential. Most of your effort went into staying warm, staying fed, and doing the bare minimum to keep life from unraveling. This meant mending clothes, feeding animals, chopping wood, and preparing food from whatever root vegetable hadn't sprouted alien arms in storage. Let's say you head outside. First stop? The woodshed or the pile of logs that barely passes for one. You grab what dry wood you can find, breath misting with every exhale. Your gloves are homemade. Your fingers are still cold. You carry the bundle in, drop it by the hearth, and bask in the momentary satisfaction of doing something. Most outdoor tasks had to wait until absolutely necessary. Repair the fence? Spring problem. Fix the roof? Better hope the snow holds it down. But water still had to be fetched, animals still fed. You break the ice on the trough with a stick, muttering curses that would make the parish priest raise an eyebrow. And inside, the to-do list is deceptively long. Spinning wool, weaving baskets, sharpening tools. All done slowly, near the fire, with stiff hands and the occasional muttered threat toward an uncooperative spindle. Children helped or got in the way while grandparents told the same story again, and no one corrected them because it helped pass the time. Fringe tidbit: some villages had communal workdays, even in winter. Everyone gathered to clear snow from paths or help patch someone's roof before a big storm. You weren't just neighbors. You were an ecosystem. And when work needed doing, you did it together, sometimes grumbling, often laughing, always cold. But even more fascinating is what you didn't do. You didn't travel unless it was life or death or pilgrimage. Roads were muddy, icy, or just plain gone under snow. You didn't haul laundry to the river because wet hands meant frostbite. You didn't try to be productive for the sake of productivity. There was no boss breathing down your neck for quarterly results. Just the wind. This season was for conservation of food, energy, and willpower. It was a time of reflection, of hibernation in human form. You might visit neighbors occasionally, trade stories, share broth, gossip over who was hoarding firewood. But mostly, you stayed close. To home. To the fire. To each other. And yes, there were feast days. Glorious, chaotic days where you cooked a bit more, lit a few candles, and tried to remember what warmth felt like from the inside out. These days broke the winter monotony, gave you something to look forward to. They were also excellent excuses to eat the special cheese no one trusted for daily consumption. Historians still debate whether this winter slowdown made people happier. Some argue that rest periods like these helped peasants reset mentally, reconnect socially. Others say winter depression was as real then as it is now, only you didn't have a name for it. Just a feeling in your chest that sometimes sat heavier than snow. But you endured. One slow day at a time. Doing what you could, when you could, and letting the world be quiet when it needed to be. So today, you patch a hole in your sock. You sharpen a knife. You stir the stew. No one writes a song about it. But it's survival, plain and simple. And that's more than enough. Because in the medieval winter, rest wasn't laziness. It was wisdom. And if you could rise from your straw bed, breathe warm air, and make it through another freezing day, well, you were doing just fine. Your belly growls softly, and you shuffle toward the fire with your wooden bowl, hoping today's stew is thicker than yesterday's rinse. It's winter, and food isn't about excitement, it's about energy. The kind that sticks to your ribs and keeps your fingers from going numb when you step outside. Welcome to the medieval winter diet, a thrilling roller coaster of root vegetables, grains, and preserved things that may or may not have aged gracefully. You ladle out a scoop of something beige and steaming. It could be turnip mash, could be barley gruel, it doesn't matter. It's warm, and that's enough. In the cold months, your meals shrink down to whatever you manage to save, dry, salt, or bury in the ground before the frost hit. Root vegetables are the MVPs here. Carrots, onions, parsnips, and especially turnips, they read cheap, durable, and capable of surviving the harshest cellar conditions. You roast them in the coals, boil them into soup, mash them with animal fat, or just gnaw them raw like a very cold rabbit. Your next best friend is grain. Barley, oats, rice staples that stretch. You grind them into flour for flatbread, cook them into thick porridge, or dump them into whatever stew you're simmering. Oats, in particular, are your go-to breakfast, lunch, and sometimes dinner. A bowl of oat gruel might be seasoned with salt or onion or nothing at all, but it's filling. And that's what counts. You might have some dried legumes, peas or beans from the harvest. Soaked overnight, they're dumped into the pot like medieval multivitamins. Not exciting, but high in calories and fiber, which, given the state of sanitation, you desperately need. Now, meat. Rare, precious, and usually salted or smoked within an inch of its life. If you had a pig slaughtered in the fall, you're still working through it, one salty scrap at a time. Sausages hang above the hearth like trophies. Bacon's more fat than flesh, but it melts into stews and makes everything taste vaguely like celebration. Cheese, if you're lucky, has aged into something edible. If you're really lucky, it's not moving. Hard, tangy, often goat-based, and eaten in slivers. Butter might appear too rancid by summer's standards, but just fine when frozen. Fruits, only if you dried them. Apples strung like garlands. Berries shriveled into tangy raisins. You might boil them into a pottage with honey and wine if you're celebrating. But day to day, the menu is beige. Now, let's talk seasoning. Salt was precious. So precious, some landlords accepted it as rent. Herbs helped: sage, thyme, parsley if it survived the frost. Garlic? Absolutely. It didn't just flavor your food, it supposedly warded off evil, colds, and nosy neighbors. Some even rubbed it on their feet as a warming charm. Historians still argue whether it worked, but the cottage certainly smelled busy. And then there's ale. Not just for merrymaking, this is your daily hydration. Water sources often weren't safe, especially in winter when streams froze or wells became slush pits. Weak ale, brewed at home, was your go-to. Low alcohol, slightly fizzy, and strangely nutritious, it appeared at every meal even for children. One quirky tradition? Pottage forever. That's when a pot of stew was never emptied, just continuously topped off. Add new veg here, a splash of ale there, a leftover bone if someone blinked. It was like sourdough starter but for soup. Some pots kept going for weeks. A bubbling, ever-evolving cauldron of calories and folklore. Your meals were communal. No plates, just wooden bowls and fingers. You sat close, sharing warmth as much as food. The biggest portions went to workers, the smallest to the youngest, though a particularly pitiful look could earn you an extra bite now and then. And despite the monotony, food still had meaning. Special days brought changes. Maybe a bit of honey, a sprinkle of crushed nuts, or a cake made from crushed grains and animal fat, baked on a stone. It tasted like brick but felt like a feast. So tonight, as you scrape the last bit of turnip stew from your bowl, you're not just feeding your hunger. You're fueling your fire. Your body is a furnace, and this bland, sludgy mash, that's the coal. Because in winter, food isn't fun, it's life. And you eat with gratitude, not for the taste, but for the warmth it gives your bones. You shuffle back to your sleeping nook, bowl licked clean, and your limbs move with that slow, heavy warmth that only comes from a hot meal. The cottage is dim, shadows flickering lazily across the soot-streaked walls. But you're not alone. Not by a long shot. In fact, you're a little too not alone. Because here's the thing: when the fire dies down, when the draft squeezes through the shutter, and when even the blankets feel thin, there's only one strategy left: become a human radiator. Welcome to the sacred and slightly awkward tradition of medieval body heat economics. You crawl into the cuddle pile again, only this time, you notice it. Elbows everywhere. Knees mysteriously pointed. One cousin's snore blasting directly into your ear. But you don't move. You can't move. You'll lose your heat bubble. See, your body is now currency. You produce heat just by existing. And if you're smart, you can serve it by sharing it. The more people around you, the warmer the space gets. Simple math. Medieval peasants knew this long before anyone studied thermodynamics. Children are gold mines of heat. They run hotter, wiggle constantly, and fit neatly into the spaces between adult bodies. The downside? Kicks to the stomach and sudden nosebleeds at 2 a.m. But their value? Unmatched. Older folks go in the center, insulated by the warmth of others. Young adults and teens, the walking furnaces, go on the edges. If you're the unlucky middle child, congratulations, you're the designated heat sink. Historians still debate whether this formation was planned or just evolved over time, but folk tales across Europe describe similar setups. And you didn't just snuggle for sleeping. Sitting near the hearth, spinning wool, darning socks, you huddled close. Physical space was warmth, and warmth was survival. Social norms about personal bubbles? Not a thing. You sat thigh to thigh, elbow to elbow. If someone sneezed on you, you just called it blessing by steam. Awkward? Yes. But the economy of heat was bigger than comfort. It shaped routines. It influenced architecture. It even affected relationships. Marriages may not have started with passion, but you bet they had warmth. Sharing a bed with someone meant literal life insurance through February. There's a particularly odd but charming detail in some peasant households' shared foot wraps. One long woolen tube, stitched like an oversized sock, stretched across multiple sleepers. Each person slipped their feet in from either side. Romantic? Not exactly. Effective? Oh yes. Your toes got someone else's warmth, and you shared yours in return. A medieval foot pact. Sometimes, families even rotated positions during the night. Whoever was on the cold outer edge got shifted inward every few hours. A fuzzy, poorly organized game of thermal musical chairs. Did it work? Maybe. Did it involve a lot of grumbling and accidental headbutts? Definitely. And then there were the unexpected sources of heat, stones. Big, heavy rocks heated in the fire and wrapped in cloth were slipped into the bedding before sleep. If you were lucky, they stayed warm till morning. If you weren't, you got a mild burn and a very confused dream about volcanoes. Some families had heated bricks or iron pans. Medieval hot water bottles used to pre-warm beds or shoes. If you couldn't afford those, you just relied on the goat. That's not a joke. A warm goat on your legs could shave 5 degrees off the air temp. And goats are excellent listeners, which helps during long, cold nights when your thoughts start getting weird. There's a legend from the Alps that some people would sleep with their clothes under them, so their body heat would warm the garments for the next day. This turned dressing into a very fast morning dance, like hopping into a preheated oven made of wool and desperation. Historians are still unsure whether this was universal practice or regional wisdom, but it sounds just plausible enough to believe. And yes, you talked about it. Warmth was a daily topic. Who hogged the blanket? Who farted too close to the fire? who snored so hard the heat left the room out of fear. This wasn't just survival. This was life. Shared, sweaty, occasionally stinky but full of connection. So tonight, as you drift off once again surrounded by elbows and dreamers, you're not just sleeping. You're participating in a nightly ritual as old as frost. A body-born economy where your warmth is shared, treasured, and on very cold nights negotiated like international currency. And you're priceless. Because in this cold, in this season, your heartbeat keeps the whole house breathing. You wake to a dim grey sliver of daylight filtering through a crack in the wall and a sudden, frigid gust that shoots across the room like an icy arrow. It hits your face and slips down your tunic like a prankster ghost. You groan, roll over, and mutter a sleepy curse. Another draft. Again. Welcome to medieval insulation, or, more accurately, the noble art of pretending your house isn't actively trying to freeze you. You stumble to your feet, wrap your cloak tighter, and trudge toward the window shutter. There's no glass, of course. Just a rough wooden plank you can swing open for light or air, neither of which is particularly helpful in January. You push it closed and jam a scrap of cloth into the frame. Good enough. Let's be real, windows were a luxury. A big hole in the wall, however cleverly covered, was basically a welcome mat for frost and wind. Some wealthier peasants might have used oiled parchment or translucent horn panes, thin, waxy sheets that let in light while blocking the cold. The rest of us, we made do with shutters, heavy curtains, or just never opening anything ever. And you might think that being sealed up so tight would at least keep you warm. Not really. It trapped heat, sure, but it also trapped smoke, moisture, and the occasional small woodland creature. You had a fire going almost constantly, which meant the air inside the house hovered somewhere between lightly smoked cheese and burning monastery. But there were perks. That smoky haze, for all its eye-watering drama, actually helped preserve wooden beams and discouraged pests. It coated the rafters in a protective layer of soot, which, historians argue, may have extended the life of some buildings by years. Still, breathing wasn't always pleasant. You developed a cough, a raspy voice, and a deep mistrust of chimneys. Oh, right, chimneys. Or lack thereof. Your hearth might have a flue if you were lucky, but more often, the smoke just vented through a hole in the roof or out an open shutter. That meant the inside of your cottage often looked like a low-budget fog machine had gone rogue. Visibility, minimal. Breathing, optional. To fight drafts, you stuffed gaps everywhere. Moss in the cracks, rags under doors, straw in the corners. The cottage became a patchwork quilt of emergency insulation. And you learned to move strategically. Sit too close to the shutter, and you'd be icy. Too close to the fire, toasted like a turnip. The sweet spot was somewhere between scorched and shivering. Doors were another weak point. They didn't fit snugly. You closed them with latches, bars, or heavy stones. And you hung thick cloth over them inside your good curtain, maybe even your best old cloak, because there was no point having a fire if it all escaped out the door frame. Some folks even built double doors, one inner, one outer, with a tiny air gap between. The poor man's vestibule. Not common, but not unheard of, especially in colder regions. Historians still argue whether this architectural innovation was widespread or just wishful thinking from especially chilly monks. You didn't just patch the house, you patched yourself. If your tunic had holes, you stuffed straw in them. If your shoes leaked, you lined them with moss or cloth. You became your own walking insulation project, rustling softly with every step like a sack of dried leaves. And yes, sometimes you sealed yourself in entirely. You'd shutter the window, bar the door, tuck every curtain, then settle by the fire and hope the air lasted until morning. It got stale, sure, but it stayed warmer. The price of not freezing was often waking up slightly dizzy, coughing, and swearing off fires for about 15 minutes. There's even an odd belief that circulated in some parts of medieval Europe that letting in too much cold air would make your blood thicken and freeze your thoughts. So, some folks sealed their cottages completely at night, choosing suffocating warmth over the chance of a brain freeze. There's no modern science behind it, but when your eyebrows have actual frost on them indoors, you start entertaining some unusual theories. So tonight, you stomp around your cottage, feeling for cold pockets with your bare fingers. You poke at the wall. You adjust the shutter again. You stuff a new rag into a crack near the floor that seems to breathe in cold like a medieval mouth. The fire crackles behind you, throwing warm shadows against your smoky wall. Your breath still fogs a little in the air. But you've done what you can. You've sealed the gaps, doubled the curtains, and wrapped yourself in more layers than a pastry. Outside, the wind howls. Inside, you shiver slightly, then settle. It's not warm, but it's not freezing. And in a world made of smoke, straw, and stubbornness, that's a win. You're reaching for another log when your hand hesitates. You glance at the woodpile, small, sad, dwindling faster than you'd like, and then at the door. Beyond it lies the forest, sure, but it also lies the landlord's land. And that, my friend, is where things get tricky. Because in medieval winters, firewood wasn't just warmth, it was power. And power, as usual, didn't trickle down to the people holding the sticks. You see, most of the forest wasn't yours. It belonged to the local lord, the abbey, or the crown. Even the scrawniest copse of gnarled trees was often under someone's jurisdiction. And while gathering dead wood for personal use was sometimes allowed, actually cutting down trees, that could get you fined, flogged, or worse, assigned to the local humiliation stockade, complete with heckling children and flying turnips. So, what did you do? You got sneaky. You became a firewood ninja. Early morning foraging trips into the woods were part scavenger hunt, part stealth mission. You gathered fallen branches, snapped twigs, pulled up dry heather. Anything not technically cut was fair game mostly. If you were really brave or really cold, you might try to take small limbs or strip bark off living trees. Dangerous, illegal, and frowned upon by both the law and the trees themselves. There's one tale of a peasant caught shaving kindling from a noble's tree who claimed it fell into his arms. Historians still chuckle over that one. You weren't just collecting, you were managing. Carefully. You made kindling from splinters, bundled twigs by size, and reserved your best logs for the coldest nights. You even burned unconventional things, dried dung, straw, peat bricks, even old furniture. If it caught fire and didn't explode, it was a potential heat source. Some communities had shared rights called estovas that allowed peasants limited access to wood. But those rights were always at risk, often revoked in hard times or disputed in court. And of course, who had time for court when your toes were on the brink of snapping off? That's why the fire was more than warmth. It was wealth. And having enough wood for the winter, that was security. That was comfort. That was the difference between cozy stew by the hearth and huddling in the dark, listening to your own teeth chatter. And it got political. Lords used firewood access to keep peasants obedient. You want to gather more this year? Let's talk about that unpaid sheep tax. Even churches got in on it, offering charitable firewood in exchange for labor or loyalty. The warmest sinners, it turns out, were the ones who chopped the bishop's logs. One fringe story tells of a clever widow who claimed her hearth miraculously burned nothing. Turns out, she'd been siphoning off kindling from her neighbor's fence under the cover of darkness. Not exactly a miracle, but she was very warm. So, you rationed. You cooked meals in batches to save fuel. You kept the fire low during the day, banking the coals under ash so they'd survive the night. You slept early to use less wood. And you taught your kids that sticks were more valuable than sweets. A good armful of dry branches was basically a medieval Christmas bonus. You also reused. Ash from the hearth could be used in soap making, cleaning, even minor wound treatment. Nothing wasted. Every part of the burn had value. And still, sometimes you run out. Those were the worst nights. You'd huddle around a candle, pile on every layer you owned, maybe even leave the house to sleep in the barn because at least the animals generated heat. Desperation taught you creativity, and creativity taught you to appreciate every twig. So tonight, as you eye the firewood and consider tomorrow's foraging trip, you weigh your options carefully. One more log now means one less tomorrow. The wind howls outside, but the fire inside flickers steady for now. And in the soft glow, you whisper a silent thank you to that crooked branch you found yesterday. It may not be noble wood, or even legal wood, but it's your wood. And tonight, it's buying you another hour of sleep without shivering. You hold the damp tunic by the fire, arms aching, steam rising in hesitant curls. It smells like wool, smoke, and regret. You didn't want to wash it today, but the smell had started to weaponize, and even the chickens looked offended. Winter laundry, medieval style, a test of patience, endurance, and how many fingers you can still feel afterward. Let's be clear, doing laundry in winter wasn't a weekly event. It wasn't even monthly in some cases. Washing clothes in the dead cold meant icy water, cracked skin, and the very real risk of freezing your socks and your dignity. But every now and then, something just had to be washed. So you braced yourself. You likely used a stream, if it hadn't frozen solid. If it had, you found a basin or cauldron, hauled in water, and heated it over the fire, a slow, grumbling process involving lots of stirring and cursing. Then you dunked the garment, rubbed it with ashes or lye soap if you had any, and beat it on a flat rock or plank to clean it. Also to vent your frustration. Historians still argue about how often peasants actually washed their clothes. Some say a few times a season. Others suggest it varied widely by region and income. One thing is clear, your cleanest tunic was the one least recently worn. You didn't own many clothes. Maybe 2 sets. 3 if you were wealthy or had a very productive spouse. So when you washed something, you wore the other. Or nothing. Or borrowed from a sibling who was about your size if you squinted and held your breath. And when it came to drying clothes in winter, good luck. You hung them by the fire, draped them over benches, or strung them up like laundry prayer flags across the ceiling. The goal wasn't to dry them completely, just enough so they didn't freeze solid or grow a new civilization of mildew. Let's talk socks. Woolen hose, foot wrappings, scraps of linen, whatever you called them, they got gross fast. You might rinse them more often, simply because the smell built up until even the dog left the room. But drying them took forever. People stuffed them near the fire, under blankets, or even inside their shirts during the day just to speed the process. That's right, you were literally body drying your socks like a medieval dryer sheet. And shoes? Hoo boy. Leather stiffened into toe-breaking armor in the cold. If you washed them, and that was rare, you stuffed them with straw or rags while they dried to keep their shape. Otherwise, they shriveled into foot coffins. So most peasants just knocked the mud off and hoped no one looked too closely. Now, here's a quirky bit. Some folks didn't bother washing outer garments at all. Wool cloaks and tunics were simply brushed, scraped, or smoked. You hung them above the hearth, let the smoke disinfect them, and then pretended they were fresh. It worked well enough that some noble garments were never properly laundered, just aired dramatically on castle walls. Medieval febris, if you will. As for undergarments, if you had them, they got the most attention. Linen shifts or chemises absorbed sweat and protected outer layers. These were your actual washables, scrubbed whenever humanly possible, because they were your only defense against becoming a full-time fungus farm. The communal aspect of laundry couldn't be ignored either. In warmer months, people gathered at streams or washhouses to scrub, rinse, and gossip. In winter, you were usually on your own, sleeves wet, fingers red, hoping you didn't spill boiling water on your boots. Some households even skipped washing altogether during the coldest weeks, relying on the cold itself to kill odors. Clothes were aired outside, frozen stiff, then beaten to shake loose dirt and spirits alike. Historians still laugh about the practice of snow scrubbing, where garments were rubbed in clean snow as a kind of icy dry cleaning. It worked. Sort of. You glance back at the tunic by the hearth. It's steaming now, not quite dry, but wearable. You rotate it like a roasting chicken, trying not to scorch it or yourself. The fire pops, a shower of sparks dancing up into the rafters, and you sigh. Laundry day, complete. Tomorrow, you'll wear it again. Stiff at first, but eventually, it'll mold to your shape like all well-loved garments. Not fresh, not fragrant, but yours. And in this winter, that's good enough. Because staying clean in medieval winter wasn't about sparkle. It was about survival. And if you could manage even one warm, dry sock, you were winning. You're sitting by the fire again, legs tucked beneath a blanket, nursing a lukewarm bowl of gruel that probably contains 3 different root vegetables pretending to be one. Your toes are finally warmish, and your cloak doesn't smell too much like boiled onion. You've made it this far. But now, let's talk about the strange things medieval peasants believed would help them stay warm. Because when science hadn't yet arrived and winter had, you filled the gaps with a hearty stew of folklore, superstition, and that one weird thing your aunt swore by because her neighbor's cousin didn't freeze after trying it. Let's start with garlic. Yes, the stinky, spicy bulb that made your breath lethal and your broth tolerable. Peasants believed garlic heated the body from within. You might eat it raw, mash it into a paste, or stuff it into your shoes. Not for flavor though, that was a bonus, but because it was supposed to stimulate the humors and warm the blood. Historians still argue how much of this was nutritional value and how much was hopeful mythology, but let's be real, garlic makes everything feel more alive. Then there were foot poultices. You'd take animal fat, herbs, garlic, of course, and smear the mixture onto your feet before wrapping them in cloth. Some even added pepper or mustard seed to wake up the soles. The result? A tingling, burning sensation that was definitely warm and potentially regrettable. You also might rub your hands with lard. Not because it moisturized though, surprise, it kind of did, but because it supposedly sealed in heat. Your hands got a nice greasy coating, repelled water, and glistened like medieval ham. Uncomfortable? Yes. Effective? Depends on your desperation level. A fun fringe belief? That drinking warm ale before bed kept you warmer through the night. Which, scientifically speaking, doesn't quite hold up, but it felt warm going down, and that was half the battle. Some folks even believed alcohol woke up the blood. Others knew it just made you care a little less that your bed was made of straw and frost. Then there were charms, woven cords, small tokens, or bits of cloth blessed by a priest. Some were worn around the neck or tied to the wrist, infused with warmth through prayer or ritual. Whether or not they worked, the belief did. And belief, in winter, is its own kind of fuel. Herbs were also part of the magical warming toolbox. Rosemary and thyme were burned in little bundles, partly for scent, partly for symbolic heat. Some women stitched herbs into little pouches and tucked them into children's tunics to keep them fiery of spirit. It probably didn't do much for temperature, but at least it distracted from the smell of the actual tunic. A more bizarre, and probably less effective, strategy? Singing. Or more precisely, humming or chanting certain phrases thought to vibrate the blood and stir the warmth within. Children were encouraged to jump and sing fire songs, some of which were just creative ways of keeping them active indoors without knocking over the cauldron. You'd also find folks clutching heated stones or bricks, swearing that holding them near the stomach kept the fire within burning stronger. Stomach warmth was especially important, seen as the body's hearth. Cold feet? Manageable. Cold belly? Disaster. And, of course, layers weren't just practical, they were sometimes believed to hold last year's warmth. That is, a well-worn cloak or tunic was thought to remember heat, retaining the memory of summer sun in its threads. It's sweet. Not scientific. But sweet. One odd belief involved breath. That breathing deeply through the nose and exhaling through pursed lips helped keep internal heat circulating. You tried it now and then, especially when stuck outside tending animals. It didn't stop the frostbite, but it gave you something to do besides swearing. Even sleeping positions had mythologies. Some said curling into a tight ball locked the fire in your chest. Others argued that stretching out let the body breathe heat more efficiently. You experimented depending on how much room the goat left you. Historians still dig through this tapestry of belief, trying to separate desperate tradition from symbolic wisdom. And it's true, some of it had merit. Garlic is antimicrobial. Heated stones work. Singing does warm you up if you move enough. But mostly, these remedies gave you a sense of control over the uncontrollable. Because the truth is, medieval peasants didn't freeze because they were clever, adaptable, and willing to try anything. Even if it meant stuffing onion paste into their socks and chanting about inner fires while huddled beneath a damp fir. And tonight, as you rub your hands together, no lard this time, just friction, and pull your hood low over your ears, you smile at the absurdity of it all. Magic, medicine, myth, it didn't matter what worked as long as something did. Because when you're fighting winter with straw, garlic, and good guesses, you don't need science. You just need hope. The wind presses against your cottage like a giant, grumpy sheep trying to get in. You're already tucked into your sleeping nook, but tonight, it's not enough. The fire's burned low, your feet feel like frozen rutabagas, and even the goat has wandered off to find a warmer spot. Time to activate the deep winter protocol, medieval sleep strategy mode. First things first, sleeping in shifts. It's not glamorous, but it works. In a household with limited bedding and an even more limited firewood supply, people didn't always sleep all at once. Someone might stay up late to tend the hearth, stir the coals, or keep an eye on the stew pot that's doubled as dinner and tomorrow's breakfast. That someone rotates, of course, because nobody wants to be the night watch every night. The rest of the family, they rotate too. If the bed space is limited and you're trying to make the most of the fire's heat, some people sleep while others sit near the coals, absorbing what warmth they can. Later, they swap. Like a poorly organized game of musical chairs, but with more snoring and fewer chairs. Then there's the matter of what you bring into bed with you. The rocks, for example. Earlier that evening, you placed a few smooth stones in the ashes of the fire. Not too close, you've learned that lesson. Now they're wrapped in cloth and slipped into your straw mattress like medieval heating pads. You push your feet against one and hiss through your teeth. Still hot. Still worth it. Others used pans filled with embers carefully sealed to avoid burning down the house, or iron rods heated and placed under the bed. If you were wealthier, you might have a bed warmer, a long-handled brass pan used to swish hot coals around the sheets before bedtime. But let's face it, you have a rock, and you're happy it didn't catch fire. And then there's the sheep. Or maybe the dog. Or both, depending on how generous you're feeling. You sleep in close contact, either in the same bed or close enough to steal each other's warmth without too much protest. One folk saying even claims that 2 dogs and a child keep the cold at bay, a proverb that tells you all you need to know about medieval prioritization. You lie there, under layers of wool, fur, and a blanket that might once have been your uncle's cloak. Your nose peeks out, the only part brave enough to face the air. Everything else is cocooned. The trick is not moving too much. You've spent all day heating up the bed with your body, and any unnecessary flailing loses that heat to the night. You remember the trick your grandmother taught you: breathe into the blanket to warm it. It fogs up the interior, sure, but for a few seconds, it's bliss. Just try not to do it too often, unless you enjoy the sensation of sleeping in a damp sock. Let's not forget the mattress. It's not foam or feathers, it's straw. Sometimes hay, sometimes dried rushes. It rustles when you turn, pokes you in places best left unmentioned, and smells faintly of everything you've ever owned. But it's dry, and in winter, dry means everything. You might sleep with your clothes on. In fact, you definitely sleep with your clothes on. Undressing is a summer luxury. Now, you're laid up like a cabbage undershirt, tunic, hose, and possibly a second tunic. Some even wrap scarves around their heads, looking like half-asleep bandits. It's not about comfort. It's about survival. The scholarly community still debates how much bedwear peasants actually used. Did they have designated sleep clothes, or did they just wear whatever wasn't sopping wet? The answer probably varies, but for you, it's simple: if it's warm and not frozen, it's good enough. Occasionally, someone whispers a prayer before sleep. Not just for peace, but for warmth, for health, for the fire to last the night. You've known people to tuck crosses or herbs under their pillows, believing they protect against chills, spirits, or that one cousin who kicks in his sleep. And as you finally drift off, half dreaming, half listening to the fire sigh in its hearth, you realize you've become part of something timeless. A long line of sleepy survivors, bundled in layers, guarded by embers, and wrapped in the knowledge that if you can sleep through this, you can sleep through anything. Because sleep in the medieval winter wasn't just rest. It was resistance. Against cold. Against darkness. Against every icy gust that begged you to give up. You pull the blanket higher. Snuggle closer to the dog. Touch your foot to the stone. And smile. You've earned your sleep. Even if you wake up smelling like goat and smoke. It starts with a cough. Not yours, your neighbor's. Raspy, deep, echoing through the thin walls like a warning bell. You pull your cloak tighter around your shoulders and sip from your cup of hot something. You're not sure what's in it, but it's supposed to help. Welcome to the world of medieval home remedies, where illness met imagination, and every ailment had an herbal answer, a whispered prayer, or a gooey potion that looked like it belonged in a witch's cauldron. Tonight, you're trying one of the classics, hot onion broth with garlic and sage. It doesn't taste amazing, more like a savory puddle, but it's warm, and warmth counts for everything right now. Garlic, of course, was the MVP. Said to chase away everything from bad spirits to the plague, it was crammed into stews, rubbed on the soles of feet, and sometimes even worn around the neck like a stinky, bulbous talisman. And it wasn't alone. You reach for a tiny cloth pouch tied with fraying string. Inside are dried herbs, thyme, mint, maybe rosemary. You can't always tell them apart in the dark. This little bundle gets tucked near your bed or your chest, depending on the ailment, because the scent is said to keep cold humors at bay. Let's be clear, the medieval understanding of illness was different. Your body was believed to be governed by four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Winter was associated with cold and wet humors, so warming, drying remedies were the goal. Even your stew tonight might have been tweaked for balance: more pepper if you were sluggish, more honey if you were wheezy. And then there's the vinegar rub. You know, that thing your cousin insists saved grandmother's legs during the hard winter. A cloth soaked in vinegar and wrapped around the feet, sometimes with crushed mustard seed. It stings. It smells. But some swore it woke up the blood and chased the frost from your bones. Others preferred hot poultices, mushed up herbs mixed with animal fat or flour, heated and slapped onto the chest, back, or wherever pain lived. They smelled like soggy garden and week-old stew, but they often gave temporary relief. And if they didn't work, at least they kept your skin too distracted to care. Quirky bit: some folks kept small iron charms or coins under their pillows, said to draw out the winter sickness. Historians still argue whether these were folk magic or misunderstood folk science. Either way, if it kept people from panicking, it had value. More desperate remedies included drinking warm ale mixed with raw egg dash for the strength, they'd say, or steeping socks in spirits and tying them around the throat for sore throats. Did it work? Who knows? But it gave you something to do, and sometimes distraction was the only cure. Don't forget the communal advice. Everyone had opinions. Aunt Hedda claimed wrapping your arms in cabbage leaves helped with fever. The blacksmith's wife insisted you needed to bury a clove of garlic under your doorstep to keep the sick out. An old bearer? She just sat by the fire humming and claimed anyone who could sing through the night would be healed by dawn. Church bells rang differently when illness struck. Some believed their vibrations drove away evil spirits. Prayers were whispered over the fire, holy water sprinkled at thresholds. Even if it didn't cure your cough, it made the house feel lighter, holier, somehow less heavy with shadow. And when things got truly bad, when someone burned with fever and no stew or song could soothe them, you turned to your last resort, heat. You wrapped them in every fur, pushed them closest to the fire, fed them hot broth sip by shaky sip. You stayed awake with them through the longest nights, watching for that moment when breathing eased or stopped. It wasn't just healing. It was hope. It was care disguised as ritual, love disguised as poultices. Maybe it worked. Maybe it didn't. But in a world where medicine came in the shape of herbs, warmth, and belief, every effort mattered. You rub your own hands now, dry and cracked, and take another slow sip of your herbal sludge. Is it helping? You don't know. But it's warm. It smells like something alive. And for tonight, that's enough. Because surviving winter wasn't just about fires and blankets. It was about tending to each other. With hot broth. With garlic. With the stubborn belief that spring would come and that you'd still be breathing when it did. The bell tolls low and heavy, like a yawn across the valley. You stir from your straw bed, groggy and bundled in 3 layers of wool that crackle slightly when you move. Outside, the sky is still a sleepy grey, the air sharp with frost, and the earth crunches underfoot like scorched bread crust. But you get up. Because the church bell has called, and in medieval winter, faith didn't hibernate. You trudge out, past your still steaming chamber pot and the dog who wisely refuses to budge. Your boots are stiff, left too close to the wall last night, and you make a note to tuck them under the bed next time. Each breath is visible, each step a protest. And yet, you walk. The church stands like a guardian at the village's heart, stone bones and wooden beams resisting the cold as stubbornly as you do. Smoke curls from a small chimney. Inside, the air is only slightly warmer, but it feels warmer. Not because of fire, those were rare luxuries in churches, but because of bodies. Dozens of peasants, all wrapped like rag dolls, huddling together in silent ritual. Mass begins. The priest's breath fogs as he speaks Latin you only halfway understand. You shuffle from foot to foot, half listening, half praying that the service doesn't stretch too long. Your feet are already numb. The stone floor beneath your boots has been cold since the Crusades. But you stay. Because faith was warmth of a different kind. In winter, especially, when the world felt hard and lifeless, church gave you rhythm, community, and something larger to cling to. You knew the feast days by heart. The festivals, the saints' days, the moments when the church handed out bread, wine, or if you were really lucky, broth. It gave you structure when the season threatened to unravel everything. religious routines didn't stop for weather. If anything, they intensified. You prayed more, sometimes for health, sometimes for sun, always for spring. You lit candles not just for the dead, but to warm your soul. A flickering little hope trapped in wax. After Mass, you might linger in the narthex with others. Whispers of ailments and food shortages mingle with news of a neighbor's sick goat and whose chimney collapsed last week. The church isn't just for prayer, it's the village's unofficial message board, town hall, and winter therapy circle. Children dart between legs, wrapped in layers so thick they look like woolen potatoes. A few monks hand out warm water steeped with herbs. You sip it gratefully, the steam fogging your cracked lips. It's not a feast, but it's something. Historians still argue how deeply intertwined church life was with daily peasant survival. Some suggest the church was an anchor offering sanctuary, routine, even alms. Others argue it served more as control, another gatekeeper of warmth, food, and forgiveness. Probably both. Either way, in winter, it was a place you had to be. And yes, even here, people used the space for warmth. Some families would linger longer inside chapels, not for prayer, but because the wind didn't reach them there. Others quietly rubbed their hands together under their cloaks, soaking up whatever heat the building had absorbed during the brief winter sun. The church bells themselves served as timekeepers. In a world without clocks, they told you when to rise, when to rest, when to pray. And in the hush of a snow-laden world, that sound, deep, rhythmic, familiar, was a comfort. You might be frozen, but at least you knew what time it was. One fringe tradition? Some churches rang bells extra long during snowstorms to keep travelers from getting lost. The sound guided people like a lighthouse in the fog. It's said that more than a few frozen villagers found salvation not in scripture, but in sound. Eventually, the service ends. You file out with the others, hoods pulled low, scarves wrapped high. Back into the wind. Back toward home. As you walk, you mutter another prayer. Not just for health or warmth, but for something smaller, simpler. A day without wind. A warm patch on the floor. A bowl of stew that fills more than your stomach. Because in a medieval winter, faith wasn't just about heaven. It was about surviving this, the cold, the hunger, the dark, with your soul still intact. And somehow, you do. The snow doesn't stop. It blankets the world in silence, turns fields into frozen deserts, and traps doorways in icy heaps that take hours to clear. But here's the twist: while everyone complains about the cold, you're secretly thankful for the snow. Because in your medieval peasant reality, snow isn't just a nuisance. It's an unexpected ally. You push open the cottage door with your shoulder. A heavy drift spills inside, flurries swirling around your feet. The snow's light and fluffy now, but you know by nightfall it'll be packed tight like wool under a heavy boot. And that's exactly what you're counting on. Your roof is sagging slightly under the weight, the thatch layered with a thick white cap. But you don't climb up to sweep it off. In fact, you hope it stays. Because snow, once it settles, becomes insulation. A surprising, frosty friend that seals up drafts and deadens the wind. Like nature's weird, wet blanket thrown over your entire house. It's counterintuitive, sure. Snow is cold. Bitter, biting, toe-numbing cold. But once it stacks, it traps air in between its flakes. And trapped air equals insulation. Your thatched roof, which normally leaks like a gossiping neighbor, suddenly becomes tighter, quieter, and less drafty thanks to its snowy crown. Even outside walls benefit. Where snow piles high, it creates a barrier. You've noticed that the side of the house where the snow drifts is warmer inside than the wind-scoured side. You might even bank snow against the walls intentionally, like stacking icy sandbags to keep out the chill. Historians still argue whether peasants knew this benefit consciously or just noticed it anecdotally. Regardless, it worked. One fringe tale from a Germanic village says they shoveled snow onto rooftops when winter started light, believing it sealed in the soul of summer. It sounds like folklore, but the logic holds. Snow stayed put, kept the wind out, and gave that poor thatch a fighting chance. Your cellar's the same story. Down below the floor, buried in earth and snow, it's oddly temperate. Not warm, exactly, but stable. The snow keeps it from freezing solid, preserves your turnips and pickles, and gives you somewhere to hide your last bottle of mead from nosy cousins. And let's not forget noise. Snow muffles everything. The cottage is quieter than usual, wrapped in winter silence. You can hear your own breath, the crackle of fire, the drip-drip of meltwater sneaking down from the eaves. No barking dogs, no shouting neighbors. Just you and the snow's gentle hush. You venture outside again later, bundled like a lumpy sausage. The world is white, flat, and blinding. The cold stings your face, but underfoot, it's not slippery. You've thrown straw across the path, another medieval hack to keep from falling. Snow crunches underfoot, but not too deeply. You've walked this route enough to flatten it into a reliable trail. Inside, the windows are fogged. Not from glass they recovered in cloth, but from the warmth of bodies and breath. The walls might be thin, but the snow has transformed them, like the whole house is wrapped in a frozen hug. Even your animals are quieter. Huddled in the barn or in the other half of your cottage, they barely move, conserving energy. Their breath clouds the air. Their warmth fills the space. Everyone knows winter is hard, but snow means stability. No sudden thaws. No biting winds. Just stillness. Tonight, when the fire dies down, you won't feel that usual sharp bite in the air. The house feels muffled. Your bed, though still stiff and scratchy, doesn't radiate the chill of bare walls. The corners where you usually feel the wind are oddly still. You pull your cloak tighter, glance at the shutter, and smile. The snow's sealed it shut. No breeze. No draft. Just quiet. It's strange, isn't it? That the very thing you feared, cold, relentless snow, has become your shield. It's nature's insulation, free of charge, heavy as guilt, and twice as stubborn. And tonight, you're warmer than expected. Not because of magic. Not because of prayer. But because sometimes, winter gives back in the smallest, softest ways. You're dressing again because in medieval winter, every exit from bed is a tactical operation. You layer up like usual, undershirt, tunic, hose. But today, you reach into a small chest and pull out your secret weapon. No, not a dagger or some magical relic. It's woolly underwear. Don't laugh. This stuff is sacred. Your mother probably knit it years ago from the scratchiest sheep she could find. But once it's on, instant warmth. A hug from the inside. Medieval peasants didn't have thermal underwear or fleece-lined leggings. But they did have wool and a deep, desperate need to not freeze off their everything. So they layered intelligently. The base layer was usually linen, breathable, comfortable, and somewhat less itchy. But over that, wool. Lots of it. Tunics, cloaks, hose, hoods, mittens, anything that could be spun and stitched. But what really kept the heat in were the hidden layers. The things no one saw but everyone relied on. Like that extra set of hose you stitched together during the long, boring November evenings. They're patched, maybe mismatched, but when you pull them on under your regular pair, they feel like armor. Cozy, slightly smelly armor. And then there are the secret socks. Not the fancy ones made for church or feast days. These are the everyday pairs, stuffed with straw, maybe reinforced with felt scraps. Some are more patch than original sock, held together with faith and well-placed knots. But they're yours. And they work. Many peasants even lined their boots with wool scraps or old fur, creating a kind of DIY insulation. Some went further, stuffing moss or hay inside to block drafts. One fringe method from Scandinavian regions involved lining the foot wraps with dried reeds for a combination of cushion and heat. Weird? A little. Brilliant? Also yes. Historians often note how functional medieval clothing was. Fashion took a back seat to survival. But don't think people didn't care about appearance. Even peasants had a sense of pride in their garments. You wore your best cloak to church. You kept your socks patched and respectable. And if you happened to line your tunic with a bit of fur from last year's unfortunate rabbit, you probably bragged about it for weeks. Hoods were another sneaky trick. Not just head coverings, these were long, draping garments called chaperones, often with attached shoulder flaps. They trapped heat around your neck and ears, areas where warmth was easily lost. You might even sleep in one. Or two. And cloaks, oh, the cloaks. Heavy, hooded, and usually clasped at one shoulder with a wooden pin or a bent nail. You wrapped it around yourself like a cocoon, let it trail over your lap while sitting, or spread it over your sleeping area. Some were reversible, rough wool on one side, slightly smoother cloth on the other. Luxury in layers. The wealthy had access to better quality wool, more tightly woven, dyed richer colors. But even you, the humble peasant, could work wonders with what you had. A well-layered outfit could make the difference between chilled fingers and frostbitten ones. Between numb legs and legs that still answered when called upon to chase a runaway pig. And let's not pretend underclothes were just about warmth. They protected outer garments, which were harder to wash. The sweat and grime soaked into the underlayers, which could be cleaned eventually while preserving the more expensive or harder to replace top layers. Some folks stitched herbs into their clothing hems for scent or protection. Sage, thyme, even lavender if it grew nearby. Not enough to mask the full body stew of human and smoke, but enough to suggest you tried. There were even superstitions around clothing choices. Some said putting your left boot on first guaranteed warmth. Others believed in blessing your socks with holy water before winter's first frost. Historians still chuckle over these quirks, but admit there's often a method behind the madness. Tonight, as you settle by the hearth, cloak pulled over your knees, hood snug around your face, and your secret socks toasting happily near the fire, you feel it. You're not just dressed. You're protected. From the cold. From the wind. From the long, dark night that presses against your walls like an unwelcome guest. you shift slightly. No breeze gets in. That's the power of layers. That's the comfort of wool. And that's how, for one more night, you've outsmarted the winter once again. You're already half buried under blankets and cloaks when something small and squirmy wriggles under your arm. It's your youngest. Warm, wiggly, and louder than they should be for this hour. But as they settle beside you, radiating heat like a miniature sun wrapped in wool, you don't complain. Not one bit. Because tonight, that kid is your heater. Children in medieval households weren't just joy, noise, and chaos, they were warmth. Literal body warmth. And in a world where every extra degree mattered, you took your heat wherever you could get it. Even if it came with the occasional snot bubble and midnight kick to the ribs. It wasn't just kids. Anyone small, energetic, and full of blood-pumping heat became part of the warmth strategy. Babies were wrapped tight in swaddling cloth and tucked between adults, effectively becoming soft, squeaky hot water bottles. Toddlers slotted into sleeping piles like sentient puzzle pieces. This wasn't about exploitation, it was family thermodynamics. Everyone shared warmth, from the grandparents at the center of the bed to the smallest ones pressed into elbows and knees. If you didn't have kids of your own, you probably still had a young cousin or neighbor's child in the mix. The more bodies, the more heat. Simple, snuggly math. And it went both ways. Children needed warmth too desperately. They lost heat faster than adults, their little limbs prone to numbness and chills. So you wrapped them, fed them warm broth, tucked herbs into their socks, and kept them close. No fancy cribs or insulated baby rooms, just arms, cloaks, and the gentle thump of someone else's heartbeat. Fun fringe tidbit. Some households treated babies like portable firewood. If a child was asleep and warm, they'd be carefully relocated from one lap to another like a torch being passed. The goal? Don't wake the baby, but also don't waste that precious heat. You laugh, but you've absolutely done it. Slid a napping toddler onto your feet just to avoid frostbite. There were even folk beliefs that babies had strong hearth spirits, making them protectors against cold and illness. You might see a mother press her baby's hand to her chest and murmur a rhyme, believing it would pass on warmth and ward off chills. Historians still debate the origin of these traditions, but they're documented across rural Europe. At night, the bed transformed into a layered world of warmth zones. Children often slept furthest from the walls, those cold, drafty boundaries that stole heat in whispers. Instead, they were nestled between adults, wrapped in cloths, and often swaddled so tight they resembled tiny wool-wrapped burritos. You might wrap their feet in extra cloth, or tuck a warm stone nearby. You definitely shared your own blanket, even if it meant sacrificing your legs' freedom for the night. Because a warm child slept better, and a sleeping child meant a few uninterrupted hours without anyone crying, sneezing, or asking where goats came from. And during the day, children helped keep things warm through constant motion. They ran, wrestled, danced near the fire. You'd often assign them tasks just to keep them moving. Bring this log, stir that pot, chase that chicken. Not because the chicken needed chasing, but because the child needed activity. Moving meant heat. Sitting still too long meant shivers. One particular trick you love? Wrapping a child in your cloak with you. It wasn't cuddling, it was efficient resource allocation. One body plus one cloak equals 2 warm humans. That's medieval math again. You might talk to them softly, sing a lullaby, or just sit in silence, feeling their tiny breath warm the fabric. Of course, children weren't always cooperative heaters. They kicked. They whined. They drooled. They slipped out of blankets at the worst times, then cried because they were cold. But when they finally settled quiet, warm, trusting, you remembered why this strategy worked so well. Because warmth in winter wasn't just about fire. It was about people. About holding, huddling, helping each other stay alive one cold night at a time. And as the wind picks up outside and snow scrapes softly against the shutters, you shift, wrapping the child tighter in your arms. You're not just keeping them warm. They're keeping you warm too. The cold's been creeping in again. Not just into your cottage but into your bones. You can feel it behind your knees, in the space between your shoulder blades, like the draft has learned to walk. Time to improvise. Again. You look around your home, mud walls, thatched roof, a bed that crunches, and reach for the most medieval solution in the book: more stuffing. More insulation. More anything. The first thing to go under siege? Your tunic. It's already layered, already thick, but you grab a bit of spare wool and start tucking. Into the sleeves, around the neckline, under the belt. You're stuffing your clothes like a turkey, except your goal isn't flavor, it's warmth. This, right here, is insulation innovation. You've seen it done by your grandmother, your cousin, even the neighbor who claims he invented the idea. The method is simple: if it fits, and it's warm, it goes in. Scraps of wool, moss, straw, even old cloth patches that used to be socks, nothing is off limits. Some folks stitch extra padding into their garments, makeshift quilts sewn directly into tunics or cloaks. You tried that once. The result was bulky, itchy, and made you look like a walking haystack. But you were warm. And in January, vanity sleeps outside. You've seen people quilt their walls, too. Hang old blankets or bundles of rushes from the beams, creating a second skin inside the house. It cuts down on drafts, absorbs smoke, and makes the place feel almost like a real home. One fringe trick involves weaving reeds into mats and hanging them like tapestries. They work surprisingly well, and if you squint, they even look fancy. Tonight, though, you focus on your clothing. You pull your sleeves longer, layer a second tunic over the first, and cinch it all down with a belt so stiff it could double as armor. Then come the leg wrap strips of cloth spiraled from ankle to knee. They trap heat, brace your joints, and make walking sound like a muffled parade. You're not alone in this ritual. Everyone in the village has their version. One woman lines her cloak with rabbit fur. A shepherd you know swears by double hosing, 2 pairs of woolen leg coverings layered like medieval snow pants. The kids just run around so fast they stay warm by velocity alone. Let's not forget the hands. Mittens are rare and hard to stitch, so most folks just wrap their hands in wool scraps and tuck them into their sleeves. You do the same now, balling your fists inside your tunic like a cold weather monk. It's not elegant, but it works. And your head? Oh, your precious heat-leaking head. On goes the coif, your close-fitting cap made from linen or wool. Then the hood. Then, if the wind is truly cruel, the cloak's hood over that. You now resemble a very angry onion. But you are warm. You are winning. Historians still argue how much tailored winter gear peasants had access to. Some suggest most clothing was reshaped, seasonally, sleeves reattached, hems extended, linings added. Others believe people simply piled on layers until movement became theoretical. Either way, it was creative. And it was yours. You might even add extra padding at night. Line your bedding with furs, toss your cloak on top of the straw, or sleep wearing everything but your boots. If you're lucky, someone's been sitting on your tunic near the fire all evening, instant warmth, with just a hint of neighborly sweat. And here's the beautiful part, no one judges. Everyone looks ridiculous. Everyone waddles around the house like a padded scarecrow. There's solidarity in the stuffing. In the patchwork repairs, the double-stitched sleeves, the sudden realization that your shirt has more patches than original fabric. Because in the depths of winter, you're not dressing for style. You're dressing to survive. And every extra layer is a badge of honor. A reminder that you've outwitted the frost another night. So tonight, as you tuck in your final bit of padding and flop down on your straw bed with the grace of a dropped sack of flour, you smile. You're a walking quilt. A stitched-up miracle. A slightly lumpy monument to medieval ingenuity. And, blessedly, you're warm. You're up before dawn, again. The coals have long since gone cold, and your breath is fogging the air in your own home, never a great sign. But there's a job to do today. A big one. One that pulls you out of your warmish, cramped little den and into the frosty unknown, winter travel. Yes, sometimes, even in the deep freeze of January, you have to go out. Maybe a relative's sick. Maybe the church is handing out grain. Maybe the pigs have escaped. Again. Whatever the reason, today you're braving the medieval outdoors on foot, with layers, and with very low expectations. You start with layers, of course. Your usual tunic, plus an extra one. A thick cloak pinned at the shoulder. Leg wraps spiraled snug. Your feet, double-socked and shoved into boots stuffed with straw for insulation. You consider the extra scarf scratchy, smells like smoke, but tuck it in anyway. Your ears will thank you. Then comes your gear, a walking stick to help on icy roads, a satchel with dried meat and maybe a clove of garlic, for luck, for health, or just for the smell, and if you're lucky, a little iron knife tucked into your belt. Not for fighting wolves though, yes, those exist, but for prying ice off things and poking at frozen doors. The road is hard. Literally. Frozen solid, rutted with old wagon tracks, and slick with patches of snow-glazed ice. Your boots slip now and then, but you stay upright thanks to that stick. You walk hunched, not from age, but from wind. It bites at any exposed skin. Your cheeks go numb. Your nose drips. You sniff. Regret it. Keep moving. Villages in winter are eerily quiet. Doors stay shut. Smoke drifts from chimneys. You pass a neighbor's cottage and see a curtain twitch, someone peeking out, probably wondering why you drew the short straw today. There are no road signs. You navigate by memory, by tree shapes, by the way snow gathers on one side of the path. Sometimes you follow animal tracks, dogs, chickens, the occasional mysterious print that might be a fox. Or something worse. You keep walking. Travel in winter is dangerous. Not just for the cold, but for the isolation. If you fall and can't get up, it might be hours before anyone passes. So you hum. Loudly. Clap your mittens together. not for music, for presence. You're announcing yourself to the world. Still alive, you say with every step. Still kicking. You remember what old Jervis once told you, don't stop moving. Stop and the cold wins. So you don't. You walk. Past empty fields, past the woods, past the bend where the river used to flow before it froze over like a forgotten beer barrel. Some peasants use sleds, pulled by oxen or dogs. You don't have one of those, but you envy the thought. A flatboard to haul goods or people too tired to walk. Sleds are the winter carts. Sleek. Slippery. Mostly held together by luck and twine. You reach your destination around midday, a cousin's house, a tiny shrine, or maybe the communal granary. You stamp your feet at the door, knock the snow from your cloak, and enter like a walking snowman. Inside, it's warmer. Dim, smells like smoke and stew. You've made it. You sit near the hearth, fingers prickling as the blood returns. Someone hands you a bowl. You sip slowly, savoring warmth not just in your belly but in your very soul. And after a few hours, you do it all again. Because you have to get home. This time, the wind's behind you. The clouds are thick, heavy with the threat of more snow. But you've done what needed doing. You're on your feet. You're full. And even as your legs ache and your nose starts leaking again, there's a strange pride in it. You braved winter. You didn't freeze. You walked the road that many feared and you came back. And tonight, when you crawl back into your nest of straw, socks, and goat smell, you'll sleep deeper. Not just from exhaustion, but from knowing you did something brave. In a medieval winter, even a trip to the next village was an act of survival. And you? You passed the test. The fire's low now, barely more than a glow in the hearth. The room is still, blanketed in the quiet that only deep winter can offer. You're sitting there, wrapped in your layers, your secret socks toasted and tucked under the straw blanket. Outside, the wind still moans across the hills, but you barely notice. Because the worst is nearly behind you. The snow will linger for weeks yet, but something's shifted. A scent in the air, maybe. A certain softness in the morning light. Maybe it's wishful thinking, but you feel it, the long thaw is coming. You've made it through another winter. Not easily, not gracefully, but you're here. Your skin's a little rougher. Your clothes even more patched. You've eaten more turnips than any one person reasonably should. But you're warm. You're alive. The world outside still glistens with frost, but your thoughts are turning now toward spring, toward planting, toward the cautious dream of green things and sun-warmed soil. You imagine the fields without their icy crust, the trees with buds, the chickens clucking louder, sensing change. Inside your home, things begin to shift too. You prop the door open longer during the day. Not wide, just enough to let the air stir. It still bites, but it carries a hint of moisture, a whisper of thawed mud. You shake out bedding. You hang cloaks in the weak sun. The corners of the room begin to smell more like earth than smoke. The chores change, too. You're no longer in full survival mode. You begin to clean, to fix, to prepare. Roof leaks patched. Straw replaced. Tools pulled from storage and inspected. Everything creaks to life, sleepy and stiff but eager. Your body adjusts. layers come off more easily. You find yourself standing outside a little longer, not just to fetch water, but to breathe. The sky's still grey, but it's lighter somehow. The birds come back, slowly, tentatively. Their chirps sound foreign at first. You forgot how loud they were. Even the animals know. The goats bleat more. The pigs root near the thawing barn wall. The dog lies near the door, soaking in the first warm rays like royalty. And in the evenings, as the fire burns just a little less desperately, you sit back and let your muscles remember what it means to relax. You talk more. You laugh a little. You dream again, not just of surviving but of what comes next. The cold will return. Always does. But now you've got a full season's worth of new tricks, patched gear, and garlic stuffed socks to greet it. You've become a veteran of winter's war. A little battered, a little smellier but undefeated. You look at the fire, just coals now, faint and red, and smile. You don't need it roaring anymore. You're past the hardest part. You survived the season that tried to eat you whole. And spring? Spring's coming. The fire fades to a soft, pulsing glow, just enough to paint the ceiling in orange smudges. The last wind rattles the shutter, gently this time, like even the cold is growing tired. You lie back, wrapped in every familiar, patched thing you own, and let your breathing slow. Around you, the room settles. The walls sigh. The straw bed shifts beneath your weight, rustling like dried paper. Even the goat in the corner lets out one long, snoring exhale and falls still. Your fingers are warm. Your face is warm. For once, your toes don't feel like they've been borrowed from an ice sculpture. The layers you gathered, the warmth you fought for, they did their job. You stare at the ceiling and imagine the frost melting from the rafters. You picture a world turning green again, slowly, stubbornly. Grass breaking through snow. Sunlight creeping longer through the day. The steady, reassuring rhythm of seasons doing what they've always done. There's no rush. Spring will take its time. But you've made it. You've earned rest. So you close your eyes. Let the last ember blink in the hearth. Let the cold stay outside, where it belongs. You've done enough for one winter. Sleep now. Sleep deep. You're safe. You're warm. And the worst is over.